was the last time you saw God's loving kindness? I imagine Adam and Eve saw it when they walked with God in the cool of the evening as God showed them the delights of the garden. Have you tried this pear? Have you noticed the particular delight of the firefly? Or Abraham and Sarah as they counted the stars with God? Or Jacob as he slept at God's front door and saw angels ascending and descending and finally rested in the blessed peace of God's loving kindness? Joseph, the family outcast who dreamt of God's voice, and Moses, who heard the particular promise of freedom from a bush aflame. The men and women of Israel surely saw God's loving kindness in the guidance of pillars of fire and cloud. And Rahab, saved after Jericho's walls tumbled down, and Gideon with his fleece dry despite the dewy morning, and Samson with his last bit of strength. Of course, if you can't remember the last time you saw God's loving kindness, that's okay. Naomi couldn't either. Yet her story and Ruth's and Boaz's weaves together to tell what God's loving kindness looks like on the ground, among the people of God, in the midst of life's real and common tragedies and disasters. Naomi and her husband Elimelech left their hometown of Bethlehem because there was a famine. They left the house of bread, that's what Bethlehem means, because there was no bread. They left behind family and familiarity and memories, that place where they'd courted, and there where their sons learned to walk, the place that they intended to grow old, and where they hoped that their bones would rest. My grandmother is 93 this year. For Mother's Day one year, I gave her one of those page-a-day calendars where she could write out some of her memories. And one of these pages had her perfect cursive, long lines with thin little bumps for letters, telling a story of her childhood, where her parents took her and her brothers and her sister for a walk, and they passed an ice cream cart. And that little treat was simply beyond what my great-grandparents could afford, having lost so much in the Depression. And my grandma wrote that it was one of the few times that she remembers her own mother crying. That was what Naomi and Elimelech were trying to spare themselves from. What does God's loving kindness look like when you are hungry? Perhaps it looks like hope. Hope that you will find a generous welcome in a new place. I think of Naomi and Elimelech like Rasha and Colette, who we met last week, and so many other families trying to find safety and a future for their children. It is a common path, the refugee's journey. Do we stay or do we go? What do we lose and what do we stand to gain? And so Naomi and Elimelech took their sons to Moab. And for Israelites, Moab was kind of a sketchy place, a hostile land with immoral people. But still, it seems, Naomi and Elimelech were welcomed there. And it was supposed to just be a little while, just enough to get back on their feet, for the rain to fall and the crops to grow and hope to return. And in the end, Naomi and Elimelech stayed a decade or more, long enough for their boys to grow into men, long enough that these men knew Moab more than they knew Judah, more this strange land than their hungry house of bread. And so those boys who became men took wives from among the Moabites, Orpah and Ruth. But too quickly, Naomi was again swallowed in grief, when first Elimelech died and then her sons. Whatever whatever hope she had wished for in Moab, whatever glimmer of God's loving kindness, she finds there only hunger and heartache and despair. Finding no loving kindness for herself, she gives it as a blessing to her daughters-in-law, releasing them of their vows to her and sending them back to their families. What does loving kindness look like for the grieving? Perhaps it is found among those who stay. Ruth stayed. She returned with Naomi to Bethlehem just in time for the barley harvest. Among the Israelites, God's law, the Torah, demands that the edges of the fields be left for outsiders and widows so they have something to eat. And also among the Israelites, God's law, the Torah, demands that orphans and widows be cared for and the dead be remembered and honored. And that practice is known as levirate marriage, where a widow is married to her husband's nearest kin in order to be sheltered and provided for and her husband's legacy preserved. It is a practice that sounds incredibly weird to our ears and also kind of backwards, but in Ruth's story, it is a practice of God's loving kindness for those who would otherwise be cast out. When you have been reduced to nothing, what does God's loving kindness look like? Perhaps it looks like hope. Because when Ruth goes out for the few grains of barley from the edges of a field, she finds not just a generous farmer who has left a wide swath of the edge of the field, but one of the few people who could actually change her life, one of the handful of men in the town who were closely enough related to Elimelech to redeem Naomi and Ruth. And so as the barley harvest yields to the wheat harvest, Naomi suggests an outrageous plan to Ruth. It involves a nighttime visit to the threshing floor, a huge amount of wine, and some suggestive covering and uncovering of body parts, and most of it doesn't make any sense to any of us. But here's the interesting part. When Boaz discovers Ruth on the threshing floor that night, he tells her that this act of loving kindness on behalf of her mother-in-law is even greater than all the care that Ruth has shown for Naomi thus far. She could have found for herself a spouse among any of the men her age in Bethlehem, but in waiting for Boaz, in reminding him of his obligation to that levirate marriage, she is preserving Elimelech's legacy and ensuring Naomi's well-being long into the future. What does loving kindness look like for the impoverished widows struggling to get by? What does loving kindness look like for people who are finally trusting the earth again to bear what they need to survive? What does loving kindness look like on the oncology ward? What does loving kindness look like in the fire-decimated forests? What does loving kindness look like in the funeral home? What does loving kindness look like after pandemic and after division and after so much change? It looks like entrusting the messiness of one another's lives, trusting that God is already there. Thomas Merton once wrote, "In a time of drastic change, one can be too preoccupied with what is ending, or too obsessed with what seems to be beginning. In either case, one loses touch with the present and with its obscure but dynamic possibilities. What really matters is openness, readiness, attention, courage to face risk. You do not need to know precisely what is happening or exactly where it is all going. What you need is to recognize the possibilities and challenges offered by the present moment and to embrace them with courage, faith, and hope. In such an event, courage is the authentic form taken by love." The truth is, beloved, few of us will be spared the terrible truth, or the truly terrible of this life. We will get sick, grieve, be lonely or afraid. We'll put our kids on school buses without the assurance that they'll make it home okay. We'll be told who we are is wrong or gross or sinful. We'll be hungry or we'll go without shelter. We'll be afraid that we won't be able to provide for our family. We'll face a dizzying maze of decisions that will affect our future in unimaginable ways. We'll stand up for something we believe in and fail. But we will never be far from God's steadfast, loving kindness, because we will never be in a place where we can't embrace the challenges before us with courage, faith, hope, and love. Amen.